Hi, everyone. This is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director of the River Falls Public Library. I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. I'm actually live from Portland, Oregon, attending the Public Library Association 2022 mid-year conference, midwinter conference. And I want to welcome our online audience here tonight to be with us, and also our distinguished author, Kate Moore. I want to give a shout out to our Library Foundation. Tonight's program is brought to you by the financial support of our Library Foundation. I also want to thank our reference and technology librarian, Kim Kiskinen, who you cannot see, but is making this whole thing possible in 3 time zones. So while we are live in River Falls at 6:30 p.m., it is now 4:30 p.m. in Portland, Oregon, and it is 11:30 p.m. in London, where Kate is. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Kate Moore. Kate is a British writer based in London. Kate is an editor, an author, and a ghostwriter. She writes across multiple genres, including history, biography, true crime, and gift and novelty nonfiction genre. I had to look that one up just in case anybody's wondering. To date, Kate has published 11 books. Her work has been featured across international media and translated into more than 15 languages. Kate is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of Radium Girls, which won the 2017 Goodreads Choice Award for Best History. It was also voted U.S. Librarian's Favorite Nonfiction Book for 2017, and it was named a notable nonfiction book of 2018 by the American Library Association. Kate's most recent book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, is the reason that I had asked her to present to us on this 35th anniversary month of women's history. And I'd like to please welcome Kate Moore. Take it away, Kate.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you so much to the River Falls Public Library for inviting me to talk to you this evening. I was able to come in person when I talked about the Radium Girls. So thank you to everyone who came to that presentation. I hope there may be some familiar faces on this one, even though I can't see you. And of course, welcome to everyone else who's tuning in as well. The one good thing about virtual presentations is everyone can join. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you to the River Falls Public Library for making it possible. I am so excited to talk to you about The Woman They Could Not Silence. It just came out in paperback. This is the paperback cover here. The Woman They Could Not Silence is a passion project. This is a story that is so important and has been unheard for so very, very long. The Woman They Could Not Silence is Elizabeth Packard, but I suspect that many of you have never heard her name before, because as often happens to feisty women in history who stand up for themselves and speak up for themselves, history has chosen to forget Elizabeth and her legacy. It commemorates instead those men who tried but failed to silence her. I'm going to begin the presentation in a moment with a short reading from the book. And after I present, there will be a chance to ask questions as well. So if you have any, please don't be afraid. I'd love to answer any questions that you have. So please, if you think of any as you go along, I'd love to hear from you at the end as to what those questions are going to be. Before I begin the reading, I just want you to try to picture Elizabeth Packard for a moment. She was a 43-year-old woman living in 1860s America. She was 5 foot 1 inch tall, a 5 foot 1 inch Wonder Woman. Elizabeth Packard had long brown hair and brown almond-shaped eyes and a nose as strong and straight as her principles. Elizabeth's downfall and her salvation came about because of one thing and one thing only. Elizabeth Packard had a mind of her own. Her story starts on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1860, and it starts with Elizabeth, a 43-year-old housewife and mother of 6, lying in bed in her marital home. It starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him? And at this juncture, let's turn to the reading from the book. Before I begin, I want to remind everyone that I write non-fiction. I write non-fiction history books. And I want to remind you of that because as I do the reading, I hope you'll see that how I choose to write these non-fiction history books is through a very novelistic style. Anyone who's read Radium Girls will know that I am a storyteller at heart. That's what I think I do best as a writer. And I hope in writing these history books in the way that I do, I take you back in time so that you walk in step with these characters, so that they don't feel like historical figures from 160 years ago. I hope they will feel like friends. I hope you will go on the journey with them rather than looking back at it through this telescope of time. And I hope that the pages will turn themselves late into the night as you go on this journey with them. But never forget that everything in the book is true, and every quotation in the book comes from an authentic historical source, a record made by someone who was present at the time. So with that reminder given, let's begin with an edited extract from Chapter 1. The date is June 18th, 1860, and the setting is a little town called Manteno in Illinois. It was the last day, but she didn't know it. In truth, we never do, not until it is too late. She woke in a handsome maple bed, body covered by a snow-white counterpane. As her senses resurfaced after a restless night's sleep, Elizabeth Packard's brown eyes blearily mapped the landmarks of her room: embroidered ottoman, mahogany bureau, and smart green shutters that, for some reason, were failing to let in any light. Ordinarily, her husband of 21 years, Theophilus, a preacher, would have been snoring next to her, his gravity-defying curly red hair an impromptu pillow beneath his head. But a few long weeks before, he'd abandoned their marital bed. He thought it best, or so he'd said, to sleep alone these days. Instead, her senses were filled by the precious proximity of her slumbering 6-year-old son. Her children were truly the sun, moon, and stars to Elizabeth. To see their happy faces and laughing eyes offered such blessed light. It was particularly welcome in a world that was becoming, by the day, increasingly black. Such melancholy thoughts were uncharacteristic for Elizabeth. In normal times, the 43-year-old was always rejoicing. But the splits that were even now threatening her country, with some forecasting an all-out civil war, were mirrored in her small domestic sphere, within her neat 2-story home. Over the past 4 months, she and her husband had retreated behind those enemy lines, prompting much anxious foreboding from Elizabeth. The Packards had married in 1839, when Elizabeth was a green 22 and Theophilus a dusty 37. At first, all had seemed well. Elizabeth had been raised to be a silent listener, and her preacher husband contentedly became the sole mouthpiece in their marriage. To make him happy was the height of my ambition, Elizabeth wrote. That's all I wanted, to make my husband shine inside and out. The problem in their marriage had been he didn't make her shine in return. Their characters were as opposite as it was possible to get. Where Elizabeth was vibrant, sociable, and curious, Theophilus was gloomy, timorous, and, in his own words, dull. Elizabeth described their marriage as cheerless. Nevertheless, she said nothing to him directly. That is, until everything changed. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, unleashing a national conversation about the rights of women. It was one in which Elizabeth and, less willingly, Theophilus took part. Countless times, the couple had warm discussions on the subject, and it was Elizabeth naturally blessed with a most rare command of language, who triumphed in these fights. Yet her victories came at a cost. She felt the demonstration of her intellect prompted jealousy, lest I outshine him. Theophilus was stung to the quick, and his grievances slowly grew. He was the kind of man who counted them like pennies, recording slights in his diary with the miserly accuracy of a rich man unwilling to share his wealth. He grumbled crossly, "My wife was unfavourably affected by the tone of society, and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along." Perhaps the notion that caused him most consternation? In Elizabeth's words, "I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his." Elizabeth's newfound autonomy was anathema to Theophilus. "Wives, obey your husbands" became a scriptural passage oft quoted in their home. But Elizabeth was no longer silently listening. Defiantly, she kept on articulating her own thoughts, asserting her own self, inspired by the women's rights movement that it was her right to do so. Theophilus's response was telling. He did not allow his wife agency. He did not encourage her independence. Instead, he wrote that he had sad reason to fear his wife's mind was getting out of order. She was becoming insane on the subject of women's rights. On the morning of June 18th, 1860, Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in bed, her disquiet slowly intensifying. Over the past 4 months, she and her husband had grown increasingly bereft. Theophilus had made it plain he wanted her gone. He could not cope with his newly outspoken wife, with her independent mind and her independent spirit, not least because Elizabeth did not keep her new character confined to their home. She asserted herself in public too. In the face of her impassioned eloquence, Theophilus felt powerless and furiously impotent. He conceived a plan. He kept it simple, just 7 words intended to silence her, once and for all. When the Packards next argued, he warned Elizabeth, if she did not conform, "I shall put you into the asylum." Now you might think, as Elizabeth Packard did, well, what a ridiculous thing to say. Of course he can't send her away just for being an assertive woman. Of course he can't get her locked up in an insane asylum just for standing up to him. But there you, like Elizabeth, would be wrong. Because as crazy as it seems to us today, in the 19th century, women were regularly committed for acts of self-assertion. Any woman who dared to be different was seen as mad indeed. And so, as Theophilus made his intentions clear to his parishioners, Elizabeth found that her community turned against her too. The moment her preacher husband, this figurehead within their community, espoused his view that his outspoken wife was going mad, other people viewed her actions through this prism of madness too. And so, when Theophilus did not clean the yard and Elizabeth shouted at him, this image of an angry, outspoken woman was seen as a mad woman. Similarly, as Theophilus tried to control her more and more, and Elizabeth protested against this and confided a dislike of her husband for his controlling ways, well, that dislike of husband was seen as insanity. Because, of course, she was a 19th century wife. She had committed herself to her husband. He was supposed to be the be-all and end-all of her life. To dislike her husband? Well, surely that was madness. But perhaps most damning of all in terms of the parishioners' evidence of Elizabeth's madness was the fact that they considered her to indulge in incessant talking, This idea of a woman using her tongue was seen as madness too. Incidentally, that's something that even into the 20th century makes itself known. There were social studies research conducted around about 2018, and they looked at women who spoke up in meetings and what people thought of them. And in fact, people thought women were dominating the conversation and speaking too much if they were only speaking about 30% of the time. Any woman who spoke at all was seen as speaking too much because it differed from that spectre of the silent woman. In Elizabeth's case, she found that the community therefore turned against her. But perhaps the worst thing of all was not that people were seeing her understandable, rational actions through this prism of madness. It was that the doctors agreed with her husband too. In the 19th century, women who had ungovernable personalities, just like Elizabeth, or women who had strong personalities, plenty of what is termed nerve, these were actually textbook examples of female insanity in the 19th century. And Elizabeth, of course, was a textbook case. The theory ran that a woman who wanted more than anything, anything beyond her domestic sphere, a woman who wanted to be more than just a wife or a mother, was unfeminine, therefore unnatural, therefore diseased, and therefore sick in the head. The diagnosis was something called moral insanity, and essentially it was defined by eccentricity of conduct. But of course, eccentricity of conduct, like beauty, is all in the eye of the beholder. In fact, Elizabeth's assertiveness was not the only strike against her. Not only was she an assertive woman, she was an educated woman too. And in the 19th century, women who studied or even simply read were seen as at increased risk of going mad. As I was researching the book, I found notes from a doctor's visit to an all-girls high school in 1858. And he remarked upon visiting this all-girls school, he said to the teachers, "You are training your girls for the lunatic asylum." There was such a strong correlation between these things. Similarly, as I delved into the asylum's own records, I found listed the reasons for insanity, and among them was listed reading novels. I found case notes from May 1860, just a month before the book opens with Elizabeth lying in bed, worrying about her husband's threat to send her to an asylum. And in May 1860, a 15-year-old girl, known only as B, was committed to an asylum because she had become greatly addicted to reading novels. In Elizabeth's case, her husband's application landed on the desk of one Dr. Andrew McFarland. He was the superintendent of the Illinois State Hospital, and we can turn to him perhaps to find out what was the reason behind this thinking. Why did they think that educated women were more likely to go mad? According to McFarland, it was because minds of limited capacity, when they tried to comprehend subjects beyond them, well, that would ultimately lead to mental breakdown. When Theophilus's application landed on McFarland's desk, he read it with interest and promptly admitted Elizabeth Packard. On a hot summer's night in June 1860, she climbed the stone steps of the insane asylum and found that the doors slammed shut behind her. According to the records, she was admitted for excessive application of body and mind, or as she herself put it, she'd been placed there by her husband for thinking. At first, Elizabeth Packard wasn't too concerned by what had happened. She trusted in the reality and the rationality of the situation. She thought she would be out in no time. She would simply appeal to the law for recourse and she would find herself free once more. But Elizabeth was in for a shock, because not only were the doctors on her husband's side, the law was too. In America, at that time, there was a law known as coverture, which had been inherited from the 1100s in England. It seems we Brits have a lot to answer for. Coverture essentially said that when a woman marries a man, she loses her own identity, her legal identity, her civic identity. By law, she becomes merely the shadow of her spouse. She has no right to her own earnings. She has no right to property, to the custody of her children, even to her very liberty. And in fact, this is the reality that Elizabeth now collided with. By law in Illinois, husbands could send their wives to asylums simply by request, and specifically without the evidence of insanity that was required in other cases. And we may think, well, it's 160 years ago. They did things differently then. But in fact, these unjust laws echoed throughout the 20th century too. So, for example, did you know that it wasn't until 1974 that a woman could get a credit card independently? Before then, a man had to co-sign any credit application, and a bank would also discount a woman's earnings by as much as 50% when deciding how much credit to grant. In Elizabeth's case, she realised that actually there was no recourse to freedom. She was stuck there, and she realised swiftly how much things were stacked against her, because as she woke that first morning in the asylum and rose and exited into the hallway and joined her fellow inmates at breakfast, she realised she was surrounded by other sane women. Women who had been sent away by controlling husbands and domineering fathers. The doctors themselves, from the medical records of the time, say that they admitted women for causing the greatest annoyances to their families. Women were admitted because they refused all domestic control. These were the women Elizabeth found herself surrounded by. And these wards were overcrowded too. They were so overcrowded that McFarland, in fact, had applied to the legislature for increased funding to build a new wing. It would open the year following Elizabeth's arrival at the hospital, with space to commit another 150 patients, and every single one of them would be a woman. Elizabeth started to get to know her fellow sisters. She was shocked by what she discovered, but perhaps she was most shocked of all to realise how she could go home. There was only one way: to submit. The women were sent away to learn how to submit to masculine authority again. The doctors acted almost as ciphers. Dr. McFarland himself wrote about it. He saw himself as the women's superior. He saw himself as Prospero to their Caliban. Elizabeth herself wrote that it was a subduing treatment. She had been sent there to be broken in. Only if she learned how to become an obedient wife would she be sent out back to her children, to her 18-month-old baby, who she had only weaned just a few months before she was sent away to the asylum. She was banished from home and banished for children, and the only way she could get home was to submit to her husband and her doctor's will. But in Elizabeth's case, she realised actually she would not do this. She wrote, "In my case, this woman-crushing machinery works the wrong way. The true woman shines brighter and brighter under the process instead of being strangled." And this, for me, is one of the most compelling parts of Elizabeth's story. The book is called The Woman They Could Not Silence, but actually the story is Elizabeth's journey to become that woman. She wrote very early on in her journey to finding this voice. She was attending a Bible class and didn't want to speak up. This is well before she gets committed to the asylum. And she wrote, "I felt so small somehow, as though nothing I said was worth saying or hearing." I know I felt in that position before. I'm sure many of you on this call have. And the fact that Elizabeth journeys from that insecure position to being someone who ultimately does have a voice and uses it for the greater good, this, I think, is the inspiring journey. This is a book about a woman finding her voice, about learning how to become a writer. Elizabeth is banished to the worst wards of the house because she dares to defy the doctors, and she dares to speak up not only for herself, but for her sisterhood of friends who she makes in the asylum. She speaks up for all of womankind, and therefore she herself is silenced. But even though she is sent away to these worst wards, and even though she is refused permission to write, she decides that she will persevere anyway. She steals scraps of fabric. She tears out the margins in newspapers so that she can scribble in those wide margins any thoughts that she has, recording herself on the page so that she isn't lost within those thick brick walls of the asylum. She herself is there on paper. She herself is there taking form, this woman who is fighting back. And actually, Elizabeth is formed through this crucible of suffering. Powerfully, she wrote, "The worst that my enemies can do, they have done, and I fear them no more. I am now free to be true and honest. No opposition can overcome me." And that message, that sense of, blow it. I'm just going to be strong. I'm going to have faith in myself, no matter what anyone else tells me. That fearlessness, that resilience that Elizabeth shows is something that I personally find incredibly inspirational. And it's been such a joy and an honor to write her story, to see her discovering herself as she fights against this misogyny and injustice and learns to become, the woman that she was born to be, as she moves from housewife to historically significant heroine. But make no mistake, though this is a history book that I've written, the issues at its heart could not be more modern. And this is actually how I came to the story personally. So the story didn't start for me on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1860. It started in the fall of 2017, amid the fire of the Me Too movement. Everywhere that autumn, people were speaking up, women were speaking up and speaking out against sexual harassment, against misogyny, against rape. And it was such an empowering time. But what was so crucial about it is that women were being listened to and believed. That was the difference for me, because I think actually women have long spoken up. It's just that we've been discredited in the past. We've been silenced, and our accusations and our truths have been denied and dismissed and not listened to. What was incredible about Me Too was that finally we were believed. We were given credit for our claims. And I was inspired by the movement, but I wanted to write about it in a way that felt relevant and relevant for me personally to write about. I didn't want to be a mouthpiece for anyone who was speaking up at that time, because they were speaking powerfully for themselves. What I wanted to do was try to find a different way to write about these issues. And as I was thinking about it, my thoughts coalesced around a single realization. For centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. That's how we've been silenced and discredited in the past. Our mental health has been wielded as a weapon against us. And so for me, that's what I wanted to write about. This is not a historical subject. This is still happening to this day. The book came out in June 2021. Literally the week that it was happening, Britney Spears was going to court, trying to cast off the shackles of a male authority, speaking out against how she had been oppressed psychiatrically, speaking out against how, as she tried to fight the conservatorship, and how she asserted herself, even in rehearsals, she would be given drugs, told to sit down and shut up. She felt she had to essentially submit to the male authority. She had to post those Instagram pictures of her being happy and smiling. That was the only way to get out. That was the only way for Elizabeth and her compatriots to get out. You look at the public political stage. When Hillary Clinton ran for president, she was called hysteric. When Kamala Harris spoke assertively in the Senate, she was called a mad woman. Nancy Pelosi standing up to Donald Trump in her electric blue suit. Donald Trump wrote on Twitter, "There is something wrong with her upstairs. She is a very sick person." So even to this day, these accusations are bandied about, they are labelled on women. And that's what I wanted to write about because it felt so relevant. But as a historian and as a storyteller, what I wanted to do was not write a polemic. I wanted to find one woman's story in history that would allow me to discuss these issues and shine a light on them, but to do it through the microcosm of one person's experience. And so I went looking for a woman in history to whom that had happened, a sane woman who had used her voice and had been dismissed and belittled and called crazy. And on the 15th of January 2018, having fallen down a rabbit warren of internet searches about women and madness, I landed in a University of Wisconsin essay that I randomly found online. And in it, 4 pages in, was a single paragraph that made reference to a woman called Elizabeth Packard. Well, I started looking further into her story and very quickly realised she was the one. She would be the woman I would write about next. Because what a woman she was. I don't think I can stress to you enough how fearless, how she fought back against all the excuse my language, all the stuff that was thrown at her, the way they tried to belittle her and cage her. She fought back against that. She defied the age that she lived in, and she herself just had this extraordinary faith in herself and this resilience that no matter what anyone threw at her, she always had like a Teflon coat that she would absorb the impact and then come out stronger. And that inspirational example was extraordinary. And even better than that, the story itself just has so much drama in it. You've got people hacking their way into her bedroom with axes to carry her off to the asylum. You've got courtroom drama as Elizabeth embarks on a landmark legal trial. You've got hints of Gothic horror as I take you inside the insane asylums of the 19th century and go with Elizabeth on that degrading journey that she was sent on as she's punished, and that inspirational journey as she finds her voice. Above all, this is a story about this compelling heroine, and it was Elizabeth herself that became the fascinating linchpin around which everything else hung. As I started digging into her story, however, I realised I was going to be up against it because there is no Elizabeth Packard special collection where you can go and research her, which seems extraordinary given the remarkable impact she had on the rights of women and the mentally ill in her lifetime. Elizabeth ultimately became this phenomenal political campaigner who made a difference to people's lives, who laid the foundations for some of the freedoms that we still enjoy today. Yet there was no record left behind in that way. There is no memorial to Elizabeth Packard. There is one to Dr. Andrew McFarland. He has a mental health centre named after him in Springfield, Illinois. But in Elizabeth's case, nothing. What I did find, however, and what a gift, were the books that she had left behind that Elizabeth had self-published. She wrote memoirs. She kept a diary, a secret diary in the asylum, and she used it to tell the truth about what was happening to sane women. She used it to tell the truth of her experience in her own words. And I've been able to weave those words of Elizabeth Packard into the narrative of the woman they could not silence, so that she literally is not silenced. Her voice still resonates through the years. She herself was a brilliant writer. It's been such a joy to work with her on her book, to bring her words to light, and such a gift for me wanting to write this intimate narrative, to be able to hear from my subject with what she was thinking and feeling at any given time. She gives it there. And I want to add about how these books came into the world. I mentioned they were self-published, but think about Elizabeth's position, a woman who has been in an asylum, a woman who is cut off from husband, from family, a woman who has no capital in any stretch of the imagination, no financial capital, no social capital. And yet Elizabeth has left these books behind. How she did it is so far ahead of her years. She essentially crowd-funded their publication. She went from door to door. She pitched herself without fear or favour, and she essentially persuaded people to contribute just 50 cents at a time in the expectation that they'd get the book in maybe 3 months' time, once she had persuaded enough thousands of people to give her 50 cents that would allow her to print the books. It's thanks to her perseverance and her, frankly, brilliant sales ability that those books still exist. And as I say, what a gift they are, because without them, we would not know the truth of her personal experience. As part of my research for the book, I didn't just want to focus on Elizabeth's works, as incredible as they are. I wanted my book to be historically accurate and for my book to have a balanced view. And I was lucky enough to be able also to consult the diary of her husband and the professional writings of her doctor as well. And so if you read the book, it is to hear from every single protagonist in their own first person as to what they were thinking and feeling at the time. My research also delved into the historical records, in particular the records of the asylum itself. And this was something I was particularly driven in my research to uncover. I'm someone who loved Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. I studied the yellow wallpaper at school, and also One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This literary tradition of exploring these mad spaces and these mad narratives is something that's always been very appealing to me. And it was wonderful to be able to pore over the asylum's own publications. They published biennial reports that were stuffed full of personal, vibrant details that enabled me to bring those worlds to life in the book. Yet there were some haunting details too. For example, the women used to work in a sewing room within the asylum. That was something that they did. And the asylum records would list all the many thousands of socks that they'd darned or chemises that they'd made, all the different ways that the women were engaged in working. And among all this granular detail was one dark detail that shocked me to my core. The women made their own restraining jackets. Perhaps the most shocking element of my research, however, was delving into the medical theories and practice of the time. Now, I've talked about how psychiatrists of the era thought that assertive women were likely to go mad. In fact, they thought any woman was likely to go mad. Simply the possession of a female body was enough to see you at risk of increased madness. A woman's menstrual cycle, her sexual organs, these were deemed the causes of insanity. And so much so that, doctors used to try to persuade mothers in the 19th century to try to delay the onset of their daughters' periods. The advice given was that you should avoid feather beds and red meat and reading novels, of course. The girls should take cold shower baths and wear drawers. And in this way, doctors hoped to fend off this disastrous onset of a woman's period. That to us today seems light in retrospect, but there was a much, much darker side to it, because this theory that women's sexual organs were the cause of their madness meant that the treatments focused on these too. As I delved into the records, I found that doctors used to apply leeches to women's genitals to try to cure them of this so-called insanity. They also would apply caustics to them. But the most shocking treatment of all was something called a clitoridectomy, which is exactly as it sounds. Doctors used to cut off women's clitorises because they thought they were mad. When you look at the medical records of those women who had undergone these treatments, they included a 20-year-old woman whose only so-called symptom of madness was that she liked to engage in serious reading. Another patient was a 30-year-old wife who had expressed distaste for the society of her husband. This alone was enough to see her subject to the doctor's knife. We may look back on this and think of them as barbaric historic practices, but in fact, I read that in the Western world, these practices to correct emotional disorder continued right into the 1940s. The last recorded case was on a 5-year-old girl. The more I learned about this subject, the more I learned about Elizabeth Packard, the more passionate I became about telling this story. My research took me to America, and I followed in Elizabeth's footsteps. I travelled to her childhood and marital hometowns, which are way up in the mountains in the north of Massachusetts. It's a landscape that speaks deafeningly of what has always been and always will be. Mountains and trees, houses that creak with age. And it was so illuminating to move as Elizabeth did to the Midwest and to feel those wide open skies above you and those endless plains of possibility. Her mind opened like those skies. She saw that there was a different way to live that was beyond what had always been, and that is the path that she forged. While I was in Illinois, I went to attend a Sunday service at the church where Theophilus had preached. It's a small whitewashed building, and as you sit in the congregation, you sit under these enormous dark wood beams. And again, it was insightful for me to do that, to go and worship at the church where Elizabeth's husband had preached, because to be with the congregation, I was given a glimpse of the strength that Elizabeth had to break away from that church and from her husband's not only marital but also spiritual guidance, to break away from that community that she had been a part of for so long. That Sunday, I stood and sat with the congregation. Our voices rose and fell in unison. There was such a cohesion, such a sense of community and choreography to it. And yet Elizabeth broke away from that to pursue her own knowledge of herself and to pursue knowledge full stop. As a coda, as we worshipped that Sunday, we did so under the guidance of a female pastor. And I just think it's wonderful that this church that in the 1860s tried to silence a woman is now led by a woman themselves every single Sunday service. Perhaps the most powerful part of my research came when I travelled to Jacksonville, Illinois, to the site of the Illinois State Hospital where Elizabeth had been committed. Like her, I walked past the stone gateposts that mark the borders of the asylum grounds. They're very old now, of course, the stone is crumbling, but they remain twice the height of a woman. And there is a very real sense of crossing over as you move away from the noise of the modern day world and into the peace of what is now a community park. As I walked through it, I could see buildings dotted about the place, many of them abandoned. I interviewed local residents who recalled breaking into the abandoned mental hospital as teenagers. They used to traverse the long corridors by flashlight, seeking out the secrets of the insane asylum. To my disappointment, the building in which Elizabeth had been held was knocked down in 1984. I was too late to go inside myself. Incidentally, when they knocked the building down, they kept the limestone windowsills because over the centuries, patients had etched messages, words, and pictures into the windowsills, and they kept them as a record of those patients' words and wisdom. The site still has secrets to share. Several years after the building was knocked down, they discovered a tranche of unmarked graves belonging to the patients who had once resided there. Though Elizabeth's building had gone, there was still much to see. As I walked through the grounds, I saw that the infant orchard that Elizabeth had described in her writings had now grown to maturity, and the trees were so many and so verdant that as the wind whistled through them, it sounded like a chorus of voices trying to be heard. I peered through the windows of those buildings that still stood. As I say, they had been long abandoned, and it was so haunting to see them, to see the way that the paint was unfurling from the underside of the staircases. It looked otherworldly, almost like underwater seaweed or a drowning woman's hair. I glimpsed abandoned furniture, a desk, a chair, a hat stand with no hats.
The buildings were graffitied. Don't open. Dead inside. But I think it is important to open the doors to the past, because through them step people like Elizabeth Packard, with her spirit as wide as her cage crinoline skirts. Elizabeth wrote, "Women are made to fly and soar, not to creep and crawl as the haters of our sex want us to." And I personally think that Elizabeth's greatest legacy is not the laws that she changed or the way she left her mark on the world in political terms. I think her greatest legacy is that she shows us all how to fly. She shows us all how to use our voices. She shows us that even when you're beaten down and everyone is against you and there seems no way forward, you can find one. She teaches us to have faith in ourselves, to stand up for what we believe in. She teaches us that no matter how small you feel, you do have a voice inside you, and it can grow in volume and intensity until the whole world will listen. Elizabeth herself, I think, grasped her potential and the potential she had left for the world, that gift. She wrote, "I will not hide my light under a bushel. I will set it upon a candlestick, that it may give light to others." To all our benefit, Elizabeth's light still shines. I hope it touches your heart if you read the book. I hope it touches your mind and your soul and lights a fire within you too. I hope it lights up your life, just as it has done mine. Thank you.
Okay, wow. This is Tanya, and I'm back, and I have to say, I'm stunned at your ability to communicate. I don't think I've ever
Thank
met anybody
you.
who is as articulate and passionate a speaker as you are. It struck me as I actually wiped away tears listening to you, and I've never had that happen listening to doing an author presentation before.
Wow,
That
thank you, Tanya.
you love her, that she's become a part of you. And I just want to thank you for keeping her spirit alive for generations of women to come. Um, wow. And I think that she would be so proud of you because you are so much like her. I mean, your ability to speak and command the language is incredible. I think she would be so proud to know that you are keeping her alive. So thank you so much for
That is
that.
such an incredible thing to say. Thank you so much.
So I mean,
I say this with the Radium Girls as well. I used to ghostwrite, and I felt with the Radium Girls I was their ghostwriter. It feels like with Elizabeth it's a similar thing. I'm just here to lift her up and help her be heard. So anything I can do to make that happen is a blessing.
you know, when I read the book, I actually went through feeling angry for her and proud of her. But hearing you say it, have you had any inquiries about a movie?
There has been some interest, yeah, actually. You've made me cry now, Tanya.
I know. I'm
There
sitting
has been some interest.
behind my glasses.
We're all wiping away the tears. Yes, amazing. There has been interest. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, at the moment, what form it's going to be, whether it might be a movie, whether it might be something else. But yeah, incredibly, there has been interest. So fingers crossed, Elizabeth will make it to the silver screen, and we'll get that recognition that she deserves.
I cannot wait. So, do you have another project that you're working on right now?
I'm currently at the stage of looking for new projects. So I did find something the other night that I'm now researching to see if it might have legs. It's always quite hard. There's so many angles to look at. Is there enough first person material? Because I like to write these intimate narratives. Whether that, obviously in Elizabeth's case, it was such a gift that she'd left memoirs behind. But with the Radium Girls, I had letters and diaries and newspaper accounts. So I'm in trying to assess whether a subject is right. There's a lot of different things that it's got to tick. Of course, not least that I feel passionate about it. But I have to say the thing I'm looking at right now, I was driving home earlier. I had about an hour drive to do. and I was thinking about it and thinking of different angles. So that's always quite a good sign if it gets into your head and you're thinking about it, at those sorts of times. So maybe that will be the one, but I don't know yet.
So is there anybody in the audience who would like to put any questions out here? I'm not watching Facebook right now, but Kim on the other end is watching. And if you post any questions there, she will put them across our screen here. Help me out a little bit while I wipe my tears away. Tell us a little bit about your writing space, your habits, your process, your routines.
So writing space, I'm a writer that can write anywhere, which partly came from sort of necessity that I didn't have a study. So I wrote the Radium Girls at my kitchen table, for example. In Elizabeth's case, we had just redecorated a room that was going to become my study. We've now moved house, so I'm not there anymore. But so that was written in a really minimalist room because all our furniture was in storage. So I was in this empty room that had just been painted with like a desk and a side table which had a CD player on for me to listen to music while I wrote. And process-wise, I do all my research first. So I don't even start a word of the book until I've done my research. And having done the research, I then plot almost paragraph by paragraph at times so that I know when I'm going to talk about, the drug practices from the 1860s psychiatrists, which bits are going where of all the fascinating historical bits that I unearth in my research. But then once I do start writing, I write pretty quickly because I've done so much thinking and plotting and planning and researching that actually the writing itself is quite smooth and fast, which I hope is how it feels to read the books as well. I hope readers sort of someone compared the woman they could not silence to like drinking like a glass of water, because she said it went down so smoothly. She felt it was like that as she was reading.
So how long did you research it before you actually sat and put pen to paper? And
well, even with that in mind, I was working on it full time, which is important to say because I know not every author has that luxury. But I think I mentioned in the presentation, I found her name on the 15th of January 2018. My first draft was delivered in March 2020, so just over 2 years to research and write the first draft.
Wow. I saw a question briefly pass across our screen here. How long was Elizabeth in the asylum, and how did she finally get out?
So she was in the asylum for 3 years. And how did she finally get out? There's lots of twists and turns of the story, but essentially she caused too much trouble because she was such a rabble rouser. She was so inspiring herself. And she was the kind of person that, even when she's banished to these lower wards and she's surrounded by filth and degradation and, genuine mental health issues, in her fellow patients, her response is, well, I will do practically what I can to improve the situation, not only for me, but for my fellow patients. So, she herself cleans the patient, she cleans the ward, she does everything in her power to make life better, for those around her as well as for herself. This is one of the amazing things about her. She's, altruistic and always pours the energy that she has, into helping others. She actually says that, that helps her get through it, which I think is true. If we're helping someone else, we can actually feel better about our own situation as well. So how she gets out is, as I say, she's so inspiring to the other patients that they start listening to her and taking note, and some of them start refusing to work without, because they don't get paid for the work. The superintendent is saving thousands and thousands of dollars a year because the patients are doing all the labor. Some of them start to protest about that. Other patients are rioting, causing damage to property because they want more freedoms, for example. So she causes so much trouble that the superintendent is sent eventually gets rid of her as a source, and this is his quote, "a source of unendurable annoyance."
You're bringing things back to mind. It's actually been a few months since I read the book, but the head psychiatrist was actually kind of coming on to her at one point. And
yeah, their relationship is really interesting. There's a lot of sort of ebb and flow, and yeah, is he coming on to her? Is that part of his treatment? As I say, I talked about the sort of doctors being ciphers for the husbands. You know, he's the sort of warm-hearted listening ear to try to persuade them to do the right thing. And Elizabeth is swept away by him. You know, as I say, she came from this cheerless marriage with a guy 15 years her senior. McFarland is 6 months younger than her. He's educated, he's cultured, he quotes Shakespeare in his psychiatry essays. You know, he's, you know, to all intents and purposes for her, a catch. And she is just stunned to have someone who will talk to her, you know, intellectually. I talk in the book about, you know, she's almost like a woman starved in the way that she gorges herself on their intellectual conversations, because her husband would never engage her in conversation in that way, whereas McFarland does. So yeah, their relationship is very, very fascinating. And it's important to say as well that even after she gets out of the asylum, that doesn't mean the danger's over, because her husband has other plans.
so I'm going to, without any other questions here, I am going to close this up for this evening. Thank you so much for this book, for your presentation this evening, for my tears. Thank you for that. It's
Thank
just
you
incredible.
for those.
So also thank you to the audience for joining us there, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this recorded. Thank you for being here with us. I want everyone to remember to stay tuned for our next program on Thursday, March 31st at 6 p.m. to learn more about sustainable landscaping and using native plants with Diane Alfrith. So thank you very much. I hope everybody has a good night. And Kate, I'm sure it's bedtime.
It is. Thank you again, Tanya. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you to Elizabeth for this evening.
Good night, everyone.